Robert talking to us today. Robert is the AI practice lead at his company, and he showed me little bits of his talk, and I'm very excited to hear more about it. He's doing some very interesting things, and but he's going to be talking to us about managing uncertainty, and as you can see, he's got the great outfit for it. So, Robert, I'll turn that over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, Mark. Appreciate it. Quick ground rule before we get started. I do love it when people interrupt me. I know that's kind of strange and probably not typical, but it helps me understand where people might have gotten lost or I might need to go into a little more depth in something. So Mark has graciously offered to monitor chat or Q&A. I'm not familiar with WebEx, so however the mechanism is, but he'll let me know when there are questions. So thank you in advance. Appreciate that. Quick little bit about me. As Mark mentioned, I'm the AI practice lead for my company. I started as an individual contributor. I got real interested in all of the various meta work around building software. I've been a scrum master, an architect, product owner, tech lead, and a variety of other roles. About 5 years ago, I stepped into this AI practice lead role. And for context, my company is SEP. We're a small, medium-sized custom software development, 160 full-time employees. We're 100% employee-owned with the ESOP. So if you want to talk about that later, I'd love to have that chat. It's really exciting. Indiana, best place to work for 15 years running, and of course, ISO compliance and certification. And when I say custom software development shop, we really focus on bringing clients in who have interesting problems, difficult problems, and that's sort of the intersection of my AI practice lead work. So I'm in charge of bringing AI to the company as a tool to solve our customers' problems, as well as this intersection of uncertainty, because lots of things are uncertain, and AI doubly so, as Mark was telling us earlier about his anecdote. So without further ado, on to uncertainty. We face uncertainty every day, all of us. So traffic is a pretty clear example, though kind of mundane. Interesting, though, surprisingly complex traffic analysis. And so a simple question like, when should I leave for work so I'm not caught in traffic and my trip distance is minimized or duration is minimized? Of course, we face it with weather too. And I love this. Kudos to Mark Anderson here. So Tuesday, yeah, it's probably sunny. Okay, maybe it's cloudy, iffy. Who can say, right? And I say this with all of the love in my heart. Meteorology is a very difficult profession. I recognize that, but there's a lot of uncertainty in it. I would posit that us in this room, the people who work in Agile and in software, when will it be done is probably one of the bigger sources of anxiety around uncertainty. I get asked that question all the time. I've tried many different tools and techniques and models to deal with it. And I think this is a big source of for myself anyway, some of that uncertainty. Of course, I think we've all seen something like this, the humble Gantt chart. Um, and this is normally where in a live session I'd ask for some audience interaction. Show me, raise your hand if you've used one of these. Now keep them up if you had a good experience. And of course, all the hands go down, right? Now, don't get me wrong. They're an interesting and useful tool in some ways, but they're a fiction, albeit a useful one. And one of the problems, we'll sort of dissect some of the problems with the humble Gantt chart as we go through this. We'll talk about some of the intuitions and assumptions that people bring and how we can address those with different ways. All right, so quick go walk through of the takeaways that I want you to walk away with. I'm going to break this talk down into 4 parts. Think probabilistically, not deterministically. So how do we think about uncertainty? A tool, probabilistic forecasting, that we can use to manage some uncertainty. And then we're going to talk about communication tools to communicate what we learned from doing the forecasting. And then I'll end the talk with a case study of applying all of these techniques to a recent project that we delivered. All right, so we'll start with think probabilistically, not deterministically. How do we do that? How can we learn to manage uncertainty? And the answer is, I don't know. Now, I asked my kids, they saw what I was doing. They got real interested. They said, Dad, can we help? And I said, well, yeah, ham it up for me. Give me, your best representation of I don't know. And they came through in spades. It was really, really nice of them. So I just love this picture. But when I say I don't know, I don't mean we don't know or we can't. I mean, I don't know is the answer, right? The most powerful tool we have to thinking probabilistically and not deterministically is with that phrase, I don't know. And that's probably hard to hear. It was certainly hard for me to think about and for me to come to that conclusion and sort of internalize that. And a large part of it is because we're in a profession that prides itself on knowing. We're under pressure to be decisive. We're under pressure to know. We're knowledge workers. And so saying, I don't know, can often come as sort of an ego blow. But I don't want you to think about it as failure. I want us to think about it as the first step. And it's the first step to realizing that luck and skill both contribute to the actual outcome. It's the next takeaway. Let's look at an example here. So imagine a spectrum, and I know it's not exactly linear, but just bear with me for a second. On the left side, I hope it's your left, we have pure luck, the game of Candyland. There are no decisions in Candyland. If you've ever played the game, you have a board, you each have your own piece, and you're trying to move through the board, but there's no decisions. You shuffle a deck of cards, you draw the card, and you make that move. No decisions. You can't throw a game to soothe the ego of a 5-year-old who hasn't learned to lose yet. You can't try harder to teach that 5-year-old how to lose gracefully. You can't influence the game at all. It's pure luck. On the far other side of the spectrum, we have pure skill. An amateur beating a grandmaster at chess is extremely unlikely. And in fact, there's a whole elo system behind ranking and understanding likelihood of one particular player beating another. And it's a fascinating system and how it ranks people. But the point is, I'm going to call this pure skill because we're not rolling dice to see which pieces you can use. We're not rolling dice to see how far your knight moves. The rules are deterministic, and the strategy really plays the biggest factor. In the middle, this is where the interesting decisions are made. This is where the interesting things lie. Now, I don't know where people are from around here, so I won't use my typical Midwest example of euchre, but just picture any card game that you enjoy. There's a combination of luck and skill. The deck is shuffled, similar to Candyland, but we have some decisions. We see a fraction of the deck, and there's room for an underdog or an upset or someone coming from behind. So luck as well as skill play factors in the interesting decisions that we face on a daily basis. Next, and I've kind of put these together, there's more than one possible outcome, and they're not equally likely. And you may look at that and say, well, duh, but it's easy in hindsight, and there's a reason we have this saying, hindsight is 20/20, is because it's easy in hindsight to look at something and say, well, that's what was going to happen. And in truth, that's not the best way to look at it. Now, since I am the Riddler, and I am familiar with the secret society of supervillains, true story, that's the real name, we're going to take this villain, Blockbuster. Now, I don't give him a lot of credit for his creativity or his witty repartee, but Blockbuster here definitely has a plan. His plan is to smash Gotham City and then profit, more or less. But Blockbuster here, unlike the Riddler, is thinking deterministically. And so his plan looks like this. And he's missing a very critical factor, that there's more than one possible outcome. While he may profit from smashing Gotham City, he may also be stopped by the Batman. Probabilistic thinking, we need to brainstorm what the possible outcomes are. If we wait until one of these has materialized, it's too late. The decision has passed us by. We may be able to evaluate what the options were and the likelihood, so we can assign some percentage to them in retrospect. But we need to use our judgment to think about that ahead of time, because not all outcomes are equally likely. So I don't know about you, but I don't put a lot of my money on Blockbuster in the situation here, and I think that Batman stopping him is probably the more likely outcome at the end of the day. So by thinking probabilistically, we can help to bring uncertainty under control. Not one of my prouder moments, but Batman did certainly bring some certainty to the situation. We're going to look next at how we can apply this thinking about multiple outcomes, about percentages, and about luck and skill, and apply that to our situation. And the way we're going to do that is with probabilistic forecasting. Now, if you've already heard about it, bear with me. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here, but this is more of a broad general talk. I have a whole separate talk that's an entire hour about just this specific topic. So we're gonna cover the surface and go into a little bit of depth, but not a ton, not the math behind it exactly. Back to the humble Gantt chart here. And I think we all know that this isn't the answer. It feels good. It feels real good to lay out all the tasks, to assign order to them and dependencies, and then watch them lay out. And you can sort of walk your way down the chart and say, well, clearly, May 20th, that's when Batman's suit will be ready. But it doesn't reflect reality, and there's a lot of reasons why, mostly centering around the difference between probabilistic assumptions and deterministic assumptions, which what the Gantt chart is really based on, is that deterministic view that we know isn't right. So I think we can all look at this Gantt chart and understand it's projecting approximately May 20th. But one of the critical things that's missing is it implies a certainty around May 20th. It implies that it will be May 20th. There's no good communication mechanism in this Gantt chart around uncertainty, around where it might actually land, what the odds are. Because I think we can all look at May 20th and say, well, clearly it's not going to be on exactly May 20th, but how big are the error bars? How big is the variance? These are all some of the critical missing components. So let's look at a simple probabilistic forecast that we've all seen a bunch of times, the humble Google Maps route planning. Now, I like this one. This is actually the route to the last conference I gave this talk at. And you can see a couple of interesting factors, and we'll go into more detail on these later, but a couple of interesting factors, like it shows multiple options. It gives me time. Now, it does imply a false level of precision and accuracy with those, but I think we can all look at it and see that there are some options and sort of get a rough idea, because of the options and the different time that's shown, about what our realistic arrival time might be. So it's pretty powerful and a good UI. But we're going to look at a more complicated case now. And we're going to look at hurricane prediction. So this is an image of the predictions of where Hurricane Sandy might go from 2012. Yes, there we go. Now, Hurricane Sandy, very important hurricane, very big, dangerous hurricane. It was very important to all of the people on the coast where it might land to understand if it would hit them or not. And so this was a very important forecast. This particular graphic shows a bunch of the aspects of a good forecast, and I'm going to go ahead and enumerate those now. So number one, it shows multiple options. I hope this comes across on your screen, but each of those dots and lines between them are a different possible future, a different scenario that was projected. And you can see where the majority of them fall within those yellow bars. But certainly some of them are outliers, either on the western or the eastern side. So it's important to show different options in which all used different assumptions or different calculations, different inputs, and different parameters. The other thing that it does is it's clear about the level of uncertainty, or rather confidence. So we talked about how the Gantt chart doesn't really communicate this. Well, here we can think about the cone of uncertainty by those yellow bars. The forecast is more certain in the short term, closer to where Hurricane Sandy is right now, and it becomes wider, less certain in the long term as it approaches the coast. This clearly communicates how many of those possible futures are clustered together in the short term versus spreading out in the long term. So it does a good job of communicating that without using words or math or symbols. Now, all I did here was drop on 2 red bars, just to look how much wider. It's quite a few times wider in the less certain long term versus the more certain short term. And that's what we expect to see in a forecast, right, is branching out of the certainty. Number 3, it can be tested against the actual outcome. And so this is important for all forecasts. We need some way, because forecasts are effectively a hypothesis. Each of the possible scenarios, each of those possible lines is a hypothesis, and we need a way to falsify them. So we have to be able to test it against the actual outcome. So in this example, you can see I've plotted Hurricane Sandy's actual course. And so what we can do as we move into the future as time goes on is we can look at which of those possible paths was truer or happened, was more closely aligned with the actual outcome, and then we can adjust our forecast to weight those futures or to take that into account, narrow in on the assumptions that are more likely, and regenerate our forecast to be more accurate as each unit of time passes by. And so number 4, it needs to be updated as new information is received. So let me show you an example of that. This is a later forecast of Hurricane Sandy, and you can see how Hurricane Sandy has moved up from the islands, up just off the coast. The short-term, more certain cone is just as thin and small as it was before, because these are new projections. But most importantly, the medium term, where it strikes the coast, the area has greatly condensed. On Monday, from where it was on the Monday, here the likely landfall is narrowed from Delaware to New Jersey. So it's become considerably smaller. And everybody who is worried or trying to understand where it might land now has more confidence in the likelihood, as well as a narrower likely area of impact. All right, so we're going to take this section and we're going to tie it into 3 pieces, 3 takeaways that I'd like you to take away from this. Number 1, show multiple options with confidence. It could be mathematically. We could show percentages. If we're showing a decision tree or something, other tool that shows a path or our options and choices. But in this case, it might be just charting all of the different things that we found, different scenarios that we came up with. Number two, remember to test the actual outcome against the forecast. This is critical to moving forward. Number three, update the forecast with new information. Now, these are just a few examples, and they might be a little abstract, so we're going to work through a little more concrete here. And so I want to talk about how we apply the same principles and these takeaways here to software estimation. We're going to start with showing multiple options. I'm going to show us another staple of the software development community. So this beautiful burn down chart. I've built so many of these. And much like the Gantt chart, this is encapsulating only one possible future. While it does tell an interesting story, and it does give us a likelihood that we'll be done in sprint 9, maybe 10, maybe 8, it doesn't convey the certainty, the confidence, and it doesn't convey how likely various possible realities are. And I guarantee that reality will never play out exactly like this, because reality is much gnarlier. Reality looks a little more like this. Our backlog might be 20 to 30 stories, or our velocity might be 2 to 4 stories per sprint, right? And it's human nature when pressed, someone says, well, what's the velocity of the team? It's human nature to give a single value. We often might average that value and say, well, it's on average 3, but that doesn't tell the whole story. And I'll go into a little more detail on that in a minute. Let's look at what we could do right here. Well, the first thing we can do is we can take the backlog of 20 to 30 stories and we can acknowledge the variance. Now, we might all look at our backlog and say, well, it's just 30 stories or just 20 stories right now. But often what happens is the backlog size changes. Even if we have a fixed scope of work, new work is discovered that simply has to be done, which is effectively a rise in backlog. We find bugs, and those can be captured, depending on your process, as a change in backlog size. Tech debt. Often you find tech debt that really does justify being done, and that can result in a larger backlog. And so what's actually not too uncommon with these burn down charts is not to see a simple straight line, but instead see a straight line, and then it jumps up a little bit as new work is discovered. Or it might level off, which is work getting done and discovered at the same time, right? And these kinds of things are not well captured. And so we should start by acknowledging that even if our backlog today is 20 stories, that doesn't mean that to do all of the work, we're only going to do exactly those 20. It's an easy abstraction, and it's easy to talk about the backlog that way, but it does lose out on a big source of complexity, and it's an easy way to back ourselves into a false sense of confidence in what we're doing. So I really do encourage us to treat our backlog as a range. It might be 20 today, and those are pre-split stories, and I'll explain split in a minute, but pre-split stories. And then we need to think about the work that actually gets done, the 30, as post-split. So we have different units here, but we'll talk about this range. Likewise, our velocity is also different. And you can see that as we start introducing ranges, instead of using averages, I'm introducing multiple projections that have different combinations. So just 20 and 30 for our backlog, and just 2 and 4 for our velocity gives us 4 possible outcomes. We've charted the 4 here. This is a more principled approach, and then we could continue this process for the numbers in between 20 and 30, the numbers in between 2 and 4, and all the combinations thereof. But I want to come back to the averaging. And the reason it's so tempting to average is because it does make the math easier, but it is difficult to probabilistically forecast. Because in order to use an average, and I'm going to lean on Glenn Alleman here, who wrote Increasing the Probability of Project Success. Sounds like a pretty relevant book, and it is a good one. He talks about, in order to use an average, conditions must be met. The members of the population, i.e. our backlog stories, must be statistically independent. Rarely is this the case in engineering or software development. So think about, so what that means for us is, if we think about that, is often if something happens that makes a story take longer or a story split into multiple stories, whether that's tech debt, discovered work, or bugs, or other reasons, it often doesn't only impact that single story. Generally, a series of stories, and you may have them labeled under a feature or an epic, depending on your process, are going to be in related areas of the code. And so if we find a landmine in the code or something that doesn't work like the way we thought it would, it affects multiple stories. Or we may find that a feature needs to change. In this case, I mean feature to be a user increment of work. And so it has those related stories. And so averaging really doesn't work because of that. Using an average also requires a normal distribution. And again, in the hour-long version, I'll go into more detail about the distributions, but often we find that stories aren't normally distributed in size. So there's another factor. If someone takes vacation or if there's a holiday, sometimes those can cross sprint boundaries. They can affect more than one sprint, if that's your increment of work, whatever that is that you're measuring your velocity on. And so the velocity is not independent necessarily either. If you're learning a new area and something affects the team, or the team has to come to speed on new technology, these are all kinds of related impacts that affect mini stories or velocity across many sprints. And so for those reasons, averaging is really a dangerous tool. And lowercase d, I mean that lightly. It'll get you pretty far, but not as principled. What we want to instead do is sample from the ranges that we have, 20 to 30 and 2 to 4. And you can see that this orange line that I've drawn here, I've sampled repeatedly from the 20 to 30 and then from the 2 to 4, and we burn down resampling as we go. And if we do this process often enough, we get a very interesting report. We get a chart that looks something like this. Now I'm kind of giving it away by showing that I'm using an automated tool here to do this, but this is simulated burn downs. And you can see the distribution, you can see the width, and you can see that it's pretty tightly clustered. And then there's a couple outliers earlier and later. And so this begins to look a lot more like what our hurricane forecast looked like. Now, if you already know, and this is normally where I ask the audience, but if you're already familiar with this, you might already have heard of this as the Monte Carlo method, named after the casino, Monte Carlo Casino, or the Casino Monte Carlo in Monaco. And again, I could spend the rest of the hour talking about the nuances of this method. There are other talks that do so. I have other talks that do so. But for our purposes, treat this as a method that samples from a distribution or range repeatedly. If you want to look this up more, look it up under the Monte Carlo method. You may also see it as probabilistic modeling or stochastic simulation, but it's an extremely effective tool, and it's fairly simple in the basic form of take a distribution and then sample from it repeatedly over and over until you've achieved some outcome. So it's easy to implement too. I'm going to point out Douglas Hubbard here, who wrote the book How to Measure Anything, again, pretty relevant. Running Monte Carlo is the only way to analyze big, uncertain decisions. And so I have used it for many big, uncertain decisions, not just software. Anything where there is a probability of outcomes, where there is a range or a distribution that you can model in some way, and you can sample from it, you can apply it. I've used it in many other places. I've seen it used in other places. Our CEO uses Monte Carlo estimation for things like company headcount over time, share price, revenue. So it's a very broadly applicable tool. We're going to focus on it, though, in the software development realm. And I'm going to point at this gentleman, Troy McGinnis, who wrote the book Predictability at Scale. And as we should do in software, stand on the shoulder of giants, Troy McGinnis had made a tool for us that does this and makes this process very easy and straightforward. Now, I don't usually recommend a specific tool. As we say in Agile, people and processes over tools, right? And I do appreciate that, and I agree with it. Sorry, people and interactions over tools and processes. Mark, you'll just have to edit that section out, sorry. This is a tool to foster communication between people, that interaction between people. And so, like I said, I don't normally advocate for specific tools, but in this case, I would like to walk through this specific tool again. The most important part is going to be the conversation interaction that this tool fosters. All right, there's the caveat. Now, by the way, this is a free tool, I should point out. So the tool starts with something like this. How many stories are remaining to be completed? You make your guess. There's a little fudge factor for complexity, and so we can talk about, is this something that the team is familiar with? It's well understood, it's low complexity, we've done something like this before, and you have some other options in there that are pretty clear. Story split, so again, this is often related to defect count, so how well do we understand the problem that we're trying to solve or the domain we're working in? Tech debt, how well do we understand the code base that we're operating in? Those kinds of factors we've talked about before. Throughput and velocity, and you estimate what it is for the team. Now, none of these should be done in isolation. I've in fact written a whole blog post with more detail about each of these inputs and the right conversations to have about them. But I do want to emphasize the conversations are the important part here. What does the team think the low guess is for the work to execute and to accomplish this goal? What about for the high guess? The same with split rate and throughput, right? How much work can we get done on a low sprint or on a high sprint? It's these conversations that are driven, that really drive the learning and get the team on the same page about what our inputs look like and what the shape of our work will probably result in. Now, once you've done that, had those conversations, you plug those numbers in, it gives you a series of interesting charts. As we've seen before, we see the simulated burn downs. And again, we can look at outliers, we can look at clusters and kind of get an idea of what those possible scenarios or futures look like. This is sometimes, often, hard to explain to stakeholders. So I would use this for internal conversations, not for external business stakeholder conversations. Another chart that this tool gives us is the histogram. Again, this is similar to what we saw before, but I like the histogram view because it makes the outliers a lot more apparent. You can see in this particular one on 7.2, we have a particular outlier. And so this is often because of the way that risk manifests in the execution of a project. We might have this nice, almost normal distribution, but then suddenly becomes bimodal because of this little hiccup. And that often represents, as I said, or some risk that may or may not materialize. And we can see the impact of that. And that is a good tool to, again, interactions, have a conversation with our stakeholders. Now, the other thing that this tool generates is this chart. And then, remember, this is a vehicle for conversation. And I love this because it's a concise visualization of those other things. This is simply the summation of the histogram and of the simulated burn downs, what percent of them land on a certain date. So this is telling us that 50% of the possible futures are on 6/4. That's the bottom of the yellow section there. And we could convey that quite simply as approximately a 50% chance that we'll be done by that date. You can have that conversation with your business stakeholders. How aggressive do we need to be with this project? Is a coin flip fine? And we can quickly move up and down the scale. And you can see that as the percentage goes up, as we get more and more confident and certain in hitting some delivery date, the numbers get worse and the distance between them increases too. So the difference between 50 and 55% is only one unit of duration, in this case, 1 week. But the difference between 95 and 100% is 4 weeks. Pretty intuitive. And to be clear, 100% in this case means all of the possible futures or scenarios modeled with these assumptions, that's the big takeaway, modeled with these assumptions, occurred by the date 8/13. I have taken this to business stakeholders, to product stakeholders, to many different types of non-technical stakeholders, and it's easy to explain, it's intuitive, and it's a very productive conversation driver. Some risk-averse clients of mine prefer to use the green numbers. I usually target the 80 or 85% number. We don't want to be too pessimistic and use the 100% or 95%. But I've had some clients who were like, no, no, no. If this doesn't hit that 50% number, it's not worth doing. So let's live in that world. Let's make those assumptions. Let's see, this is the conversation interaction part. Let's talk about what must be true to hit that 50% date. It's a vehicle for assumptions. All right. So let's talk about how this comes out in action. And I'm going to talk about applying this through the magazine of highlights for children. Now, this is the staple of every dentist's office circa 1980 to 2000. So if you were ever in dentist's office from those years, you've probably thumbed your way through highlights for children. I'm not too embarrassed to say that I still look through it because I think it's a great magazine. And I have very many fond memories of it. And there's one specific part of highlights for children that really resonated with me, and it was Goofus and Gallant. Now, if you're not familiar with this, Goofus and Gallant in each magazine would present some situation. Goofus always did it the wrong way, whether it's taking a shortcut or being mean to someone or just being sloppy or something like that. But Gallant did things the right way. And in software development, Team Goofus has poor code quality and erratic sprint velocity. So that manifests itself with something like this. As Agile, we might track historical velocity. In this case, 4, 5, 10, and 11. I'll use stories for the unit of work here. So 4, 5, 10, 11 stories per sprint. But it can be whatever units you happen to be using in your specific situation. These techniques, I should say, are all simply numerical. So as long as the units are kept consistent, weeks, sprints, months, please don't say quarters or it'll hurt me in my soul, but whatever your units of time are or your units of work, stories, and so on, it'll apply here. Now, the average for Team Goofus here is 7.5. We're going to contrast this with Team Gallant. Now, Team Gallant uses best practices to minimize rework and defects. And so what we see for Team Gallant is historical data of 6, 7, 8, and 9 stories per sprint. You can see how their velocity is going up slightly as they learn more and they get more comfortable in the code base. Now, that increase probably isn't sustainable. They'll cap out at some point unless we introduce team changes or other things. But you can see how they're much more stable as they go. Now, they both have the same average, 7.5. Now, You can obviously see how erratic versus stable, they still have the same average. I'm not trying to be super clever here. Like when I say standard deviation, I expect most people to go, well, sure, right? And you can see how the standard deviation on the left is 3.5. That's a measure of how much variance from the standard there is, whereas it's a much tighter standard deviation with Team Gallant of simply 0.5. Now, these numbers are kind of dry. Again, they're not good communication tools to have conversations. But what I want to emphasize is just how apparent these kinds of problem or differences become when we look at things like the simulation in the tool that we talked about in the probabilistic forecaster. Now, it might be a little hard to see, so I'm going to drop some arrows here as some lines, and you can see how the earliest delivery date from the top is in the middle of the bottom simulation, but the latest date of the top simulation is somewhere not yet to the worst case of the bottom. In other words, the top one has tighter variance, even though the best case isn't as good, the worst case isn't nearly as bad either. And so you may be able to infer quite correctly that the top one is Team Gallant and the bottom is Team Goofus. And so you can see how there's this difference becomes very, very visible very easily without having to calculate standard deviations and averages or worry about all the numbers behind it. You can see how these charts drive conversations. And you can talk to your stakeholders about what they value. It's possible, I hope it's not too likely, but it's possible that the stakeholders actually value the earlier best case of Team Goofus, and they really want to try for that. They want to shoot for the stars and try that. You have to make them acknowledge that the worst case is also worse. But that's the conversation we want to have. All right, so can we test the actual outcome against the forecast? All right, so back to our burn down chart. And so one of the things that we can do quite easily is we can plot where we are in this cluster of probabilities. And so simply as sprints go on, we can drop a little dot on the chart, we can track it. And as long as we're roughly in the middle of those probabilities, we're probably within the forecast. And we can calculate how confident we are, or if we're too far above or below the levels of the forecast. The math is all done for you in the tool. And that's handy to help us understand where we are against actuals. But it's also very visual, which again drives those interactions. And we can see here that like, oh, our remaining backlog kind of leveled off, whether that was through introducing new work or not getting as much done or a combination of them, but that might be a little bit of a yellow flag. Let's have a conversation. Maybe it's not a problem now. We're kind of at the upper end of our probabilities, but if it happens again, we might need to do something about it. Or if our reality looked more like this, we would know, okay, flag on the field, hang on a second, we're at the far outer edge of our forecast. This is a clear sign to investigate further. Maybe our forecast was wrong. Maybe it was right. And the numbers that we plugged in, the assumptions made sense at the time, but we need to reevaluate those, right? Again, all of those interactions and conversations that we can have driven by an easy visualization. Finally, using the example of that hurricane forecast, we need to be able to update our forecast with new info. Now that's as simple as plugging new numbers into this thing. And we can simply compare our forecasts as we did earlier with Goofus and Gallant and see what our new forecast tells us about the new reality that we're understanding. Right? So it's pretty straightforward and pretty easy. I do want to call out something else that this tool gives us, which is the ability to put probabilistic risks layered on top of all of the assumptions. So I chose this one as an arbitrary example. I'm sure no one in this room has ever had to do something like rewrite a large chunk of code. Um, I have been in that situation, unfortunately. And so it's a good example of a possible, it's only 50% likely in this model, but it has a high impact. Now, I sort of exaggerated the numbers here specifically so that we could see it easily. But when you look at this kind of outcome, it makes it pretty obvious that there are really two worlds. And, there's a distribution, two distributions here, very bimodal. And so that is an excellent conversation starter to take to our stakeholders and say, look, this risk will double the time or whatever the change is, right? We live in a world where the risk does materialize or it doesn't. And here's clear impact. And so that is more, rather than trying to communicate, well, it could be delivered anytime from 129 all the way to 423, which is a really wide range. And I think in this case, our business stakeholders would not be happy with it. We can have a better conversation. Well, this risk is the linchpin, and our range is instead 129 to 35 or 312 to 423. And suddenly the differences become quite apparent. All right. Now that we've talked about how to think about uncertainty and how to use some techniques and tools and the principles behind probabilistic forecasting, we're going to talk about how to communicate that, right? We've got a mental model, we've got some tools and some concepts. We need to talk about that with people who don't have those necessarily. Now, certainly, you could give them this recording and you could have them watch all of the other things and maybe it would be on the same page. But I find that difficult with to get a lot of stakeholders to do that. So we're going to talk about some intuitive ways to communicate uncertainty. And we're going to talk about bet language. So I think we can all have some intuitive idea of what it means to place a bet. And yes, if you notice in the screenshot, there are two ace of spades, which is probably my single favorite part of this, but bear with me here. Bets, we have some intuitive idea of what it means, but I'm going to go over it in a couple bullet points just to sort of make sure we're all on the same page. So the first part of a bet is a cost. There must be some cost to place the bet. If it was free, it's not an interesting bet. We would just always do it. There must be some cost. Now, certainly, as in the case of my colleague, the Joker here, that cost could be money, right? Money, budget, headcount, billable hours. It could be whatever metric that you have or you have at your disposal there. But there can also be other intangible costs. Here, for example, my reputation preceded me, and you know what? That's okay. Reputation is a possible cost too. I bet that dressing like this would make this talk more memorable, and I put my ego on the line and my comfort level here. As a consultant, 85+% of my business is repeat and referral. I don't often go out and do cold calls or anything like that because my reputation is what I bet. Every time I work with a client, I teach them these techniques and we look at those percentages. I'm putting my reputation along with their money on the line that we can accomplish some goal with some time frame and some odds, right? You have to put something on the line that could be lost. That's the cost in service of a potential gain. Now, the second part is odds, right? What are the odds that Batman is the world's greatest detective? What are the odds that Two-Face's coin will come up heads versus tails? What are the odds that the so-called world's greatest detective can figure out one of the supervillain's greatest riddles, right? If it was guaranteed, we wouldn't be here. This would all be pretty straightforward. So there's some odds, and we often don't know those things. Sometimes we don't even know them in hindsight. We want to take care, though, that we don't look in hindsight and assign a 100% chance to whatever did happen. That's called resulting. We want to assess that there are many outcomes and they have different likelihoods. Which brings me to my third point, outcome. This is where we differentiate the singular outcome when a situation resolved itself versus the many possible outcomes. In this situation, Batman may dispose of the bomb, or Batman may blow up the nuns. We don't know. Now, admittedly, since it's Adam West's Batman, who is deterministically the best Batman, the odds are 100% that he will succeed and dispose of the bomb. But, exceptional cases aside, there must be some set of outcomes that we think about and some singular outcome that actually happens. So use bet language and keep in mind that bets have a cost, odds, and outcome. Now we're going to apply this concept to a bet. Now this is a bet between Batman and Ghostmaker. I bet I can get there before you. I bet I'll take that bet. And so clearly, the bet is outcome focused. The bet has some clear winning and losing. Only one of them can possibly reach the orchestra at the same time. The description of this bet must acknowledge that losing is a possibility. Now, these two may not acknowledge it, but implicit in being outcome focused is this acknowledgement. I feel like too often when we talk about experiments, which is a good language for use in Agile, we talk about experiments as something that will always succeed. Now, the learning may happen, but we need to be careful about how we talk about this and that we may lose that investment. We may not learn what we need to, right? There's some probability there. It has odds, sometimes known, sometimes not. Now, ideally, we'd get Batman and Ghostmaker to run that same race 1,000 times, and then we'd know the odds. But I don't think we'll get them to do it more than once, right? And in real life, that happens too. How many times do we build the same product? How many times, outside of software, how many times do we each buy a house? It's probably not more than 10 times in a lifetime. How many times do you buy a car, right? And so for these reasons, we have to rely on our judgment a lot of times. In the words of the ancient Greek software engineer Heraclitus, no one ever steps into the same code base twice, for it's not the same code base and they're not the same developer. I guarantee at least one person out there is laughing, and that makes it all worth it here. Now, A bet forces us to explore our assumptions and beliefs, right? When we look at these other principles, we have to be thoughtful about these things and surface assumptions that we may not be comfortable making. In the case of these two, that one of them may lose. They're both so confident that they'll win, right? But talking about it as a bet forces us to think about it that way. It frames the conversation around risk, information, learning, validation, and outcomes. Again, individuals and interactions here. We're trying to frame around these things so that the individuals are learning and we're not doing things by rote. All of these parts are in service of having a thought-provoking conversation. And finally, this is important, a bet that is small can buy learning to inform a larger bet. If you've ever heard of build to learn versus build to earn, hat tip to Jeff Patton there, who I learned that from. This is that same concept. And so bets don't have to be gigantic. They don't have to be betting the, you know, they don't have to be all in, right? Betting the entire house. You can make small bets. Those inform the big ones. Now, I've talked about a few informal bet languages. I'll talk about a case study in just a few minutes, but I also want to show this template. Now, this is by a bright guy named John Cutler, who many of you might have heard of. It's a big template for big bets. I wouldn't use it for anything small. It's a little heavy-handed for something small, and I'm not going to try and read through it all. But I have a colleague who specializes in the big mini-year bets. I tend to focus on the smaller ones, a year or two. And he says this is an effective tool. And I think putting that level of rigor in place helps get everyone on the same page about what exactly we're betting on and what's at risk, what the odds are, what outcomes we see. And some of those outcomes might happen earlier than others, and they might be early indicators that we're living in one future instead of another. And so these are the kinds of things that this kind of rigor helps with. So I want to point this out as a tool to consider, or even a scaled down version of it can also help. So communicating uncertainty is all about the assumptions and conversations. And let me tell you, when you talk to a business stakeholder and you use bet language, and I do recommend using the bet language with them, you get an emotional response. Okay, here's this chart. It says 80% likely. All right, well, would you bet your personal car? Get the pink slip. Would you bet that we're going to make it? Ooh, I don't know. So you're telling me you're not 80% comfortable. Well, the bet language helps us tap into our emotions and feel and surface how we feel about a given outcome that we might be considering, or a given bet that we might be considering making. All right. Probably what you've all been waiting for, a case study. This is a case study of a client that came to us and a series of progressively larger bets that we made. The actual things we showed them and worked with them in order to think more probabilistically, the bets they made, and then the outcomes that we saw and what we were considering. So without further ado, I think that everybody in this virtual room is probably familiar with pavement degrading and has seen a pothole sometime in the last 6 months. I know I certainly have. And the reason for that is that pavement degrades over time. Now, municipalities, localities, agencies, they have a budget determined by a council or a mayor, various processes. But that budget often isn't a blank check. They simply have to allocate that budget to road repairs. And they're always picking and choosing. They don't have the money to repair everything all at once. And that picking and choosing is exactly where this startup came in. The startup said that they could come up with a treatment plan to invest those funds more efficiently than the agencies or cities or towns were doing it today. That was their hypothesis that they were basing their startup on. And so bet number one was their business model. They had to worry about things like product market fit, time to market, the unknown unknowns that we were going to learn about, the legal framework, frankly, engaging with city or town in this way, placing the money. They wanted to effectively buy the maintenance rights to a piece of road, perform some repairs, and then over time transfer the rights back to the town or city, was kind of uncharted territory. And there's a lot of complexity to that solution too. So we sat down with them. The cost was simply 1 hour. That's all it took. We sat down with them and worked through the implications of their business model. The odds, well, I call it 100% because the odds, the outcome that we're driving was to brainstorm risks and come up with a gut check on feasibility. So it's 100% odds that we would learn something at the end of that hour. What we learned was you first had to do data collection, and then you had to process it into some sort of assessment. Then you had to do some simulation of what would happen if you applied certain treatments to that segment of road or did nothing and let it degrade further. There was all of these different flows and paths that would finally get them to this business model at the end. And what we decided was there was simply too much uncertainty to shoot for this business model at the beginning. They would have to build a whole lot of things. It would take them a large amount of time. While certain parts were outsourceable to sort of accelerate their build process, they would still have to build a very large product around this. And they said, okay, our hypothesis, they still feel confident that their hypothesis was right. They could allocate the money more efficiently, but they needed to find a different way to leverage that competitive advantage or that knowledge that they had. So we placed bet number 2. The cost here is 1 week. For 1 week, we would do what we call discovery. That's a pretty common term, but what it means for us is to get in a room and for some number of hours a day, brainstorm where their competitive advantages would shine versus what their competitors were trying to focus on and find their unique intersection of the startup's strengths based on their experience and knowledge, along with the customer's needs to find a new place to dig in for that startup. Odds, 90%. There's a chance that we're just going to say, look, you don't have a way to do this with the time and funding, the runway that you have. You need to find more money or you need to find a different way or hire some different experience, right? So there's a chance here that we come up with a plan that doesn't work or we identify that plans will work. But I felt pretty confident based on their collective 40 years, they're probably more, I think it was probably more like 60 years of experience in this area between the 4 of them in the startup, that we'd be able to find something. They had a lot of knowledge in this area. And so we executed. They said, yes, we can fund 1 week of this discovery work. We executed. We did a week. Now, there's proof that I was in that meeting. The gentleman with the polka dot shirt, that's my shoulder right behind him. So it's a very distinct shoulder. I'm sure you can tell that's me. So I have photographic proof I was there. But that was 1 week of brainstorming, divergent thinking, filling up whiteboards, eventually convergent, trying to find new places to bite in. We did a lot of activities. There were tons of different tools. We did competitive analysis, we did service maps, all these kinds of things. I'm not going to dig into the details. Again, that's a whole separate hour talk on just the discovery tools and activities we did. But eventually, we were able to come to a decision jointly that probably the best place to dig in was a SaaS product that focused just on the treatment plan. We had to assume that all these agencies were already doing data collection. We had to assume that they were already scoring things on their own. And we had to assume that this small group of people could simulate what would happen when a various treatment was applied or when pavement was left to degrade on its own. Which takes us to bet number 3. We need to understand several things. Now, we costed this out at 8 weeks, so approximately 2 months of work. We needed a slightly larger team, so the price went up, the bet size went up. The outcome that we were shooting for was to make a go, no-go decision on the big bet. The big bet is building this product. We put the odds at 75%. There was a chance, 1 out of 4, we ballparked it at, that we would come back with maybe you have a valid thing, but like people just aren't interested in this tool, or we're approaching it wrong and we have to pivot and come at it from a different angle. But the goal here was build to learn, build something small in 8 weeks to inform the big bet. And to be clear, this was not we go away and we hide in a bunker for 8 weeks and then come back. This was over the course of 8 weeks, we're going to build a series of repeated prototypes, of incrementally better prototypes, mock-ups, and those kinds of things. And we're doing continual learning in a very agile fashion. So bet 3A, technical feasibility. Remember my title is AI practice lead. Here's where the AI comes in. Can AI produce good enough budgets in a short enough time frame? We wanted this to operate on the order of seconds or minutes, less than the time it takes to go get a cup of coffee. We wanted to operate, they take a couple sips and we have a plan for them. That's very tight timing constraints, especially given the very large size of these plans. And I can go into a lot more detail about the complexity and size, but we'll keep it at the fact that that was a technical question we needed to evaluate. In parallel, we needed to evaluate market feasibility. Does the market want this product? How would they use it? Is this something people would be interested in? Can we align our potential users, so the city engineers who would be in charge of being responsible for these plans, with the people who have the purse strings, whether that's a mayor or a council or whoever else is going to pay for it, right? Do their interests align enough that we can make a product that they'd both be interested in? So over the course of these 8 weeks, we did technical feasibility. And what I want you to take away from this was we built a prototype. The part of that prototype was modeling the current approach. We called it the old approach here. That's the orange line. And you can see that left to their own devices, this old approach sort of resulted in a degrading health of the average health of the road network over time. But our optimizer, and this was just our prototype, we had room to improve it overall over time. Our optimizer prototype was able to keep a much higher, steadier score. So we were already seeing pretty dramatic results just in 8 weeks, just with a prototype. Um, in parallel, we did the market feasibility. So again, we did a series of activities. We talked to users. We showed them, at first it was cards and then mock-up screens and then interactions and like all these different things to learn about product market fit, right? There's a very real danger that some users simply would never accept any new product. They liked what they had. They were comfortable with it, even if it wasn't ideal, even if it could save them money to try a different approach. They were comfortable with it and they knew it. Others were very technologically technologically adept or interested, and they wanted the new thing. They wanted to try the new thing and see how it would work. So we had to evaluate what the market would look like. At the end of that 8 weeks, we were able to put a check mark next to both and say, yes, they both look good. We can, in fact, our prototype is producing solutions in a few seconds. Funny story. In our first deployment to users, they actually weren't sure that the AI was doing anything because it was executing too fast. We had to actually slow it down because it was going from the order of about 2 seconds to maybe 10. And then the users felt good that it was thinking real hard. So it's a funny way that things work out in reality. But as we said, for part A, bet A and B, we were able to check them and say, yes, there's definitely a market need here, and we can definitely produce a solution to do it. Of course, once we learned this, the immediate question, the sort of thing that brought everybody here with, and I started with the top of the hour, was what would it take to bring the product to life? So we sat down, we used the story map, the breadboard, the capabilities map, all of these different things to establish scope. We sketched out what an approximate team would look like, and the costs of that team, the ranges for velocity. We talked about the assumptions. All of these were conversations that we had with our developers as well as with our client, the business stakeholders in the room. None of them were developers, so this was something we could have a conversation we could have with them. We built the histogram. Now you can see there we had some risks, and that's that bimodal piece I showed earlier. We looked at the simulated burn downs, and you can see a couple of outliers. Boom, here's where we can say our delivery schedule possibilities, our budget with that projected team staffing and that time. We showed this to them. This is actually the distribution that we brought to them and the forecast that we gave them. And again, to be clear, this was useful output of the tool, but the real value was the conversation, the interaction we had with them, and the assumptions that we identified with them to do this. In fact, I gave them a copy of the spreadsheet and said, here are the numbers, here are the assumptions that we've all talked about. Feel free to tinker with it. And if they feel confident they can negate an assumption or they can take some care of some risk or do something else, that'll change them. And they're free to play with that, right? Once we told them about how the tool works. Well, eventually they decided as a startup, they simply needed to get to market faster and spend less. And so what we did is we worked with them to rescope, look at cost and timeline. And so I have the two inputs side by side, the two forecasts side by side. And you can see here how the right side is the new, smaller forecast. And you can see where the delivery dates line up. And so we were able to bring that delivery date in considerably and the confidence and certainty. And you can see how that scope change affected the timeline and likelihood. And that's when they placed bet number 4, which is to become, instead of building a SaaS product, become a professional services company. We built a much smaller tool with a lot less emphasis on user experience because we were building it for these 4 people at the startup to use as a tool to augment their professional services, instead of a SaaS product that any of their users would have to be able to use without any training. We could train these 4 people on it, greatly brought in the scope and the time, as well as making it easier for us to develop. And so with that condensed timeline, they have been they've been using this in production and they've been selling their services. In fact, we've had several touch points with them since we delivered where they said, oh, we've had new of their customers asking for new features. So we've added new capabilities to this. And the plan is once they've been a professional services company long enough and made enough money, they'll use that to reinvest in us to turn this into a SaaS platform. So you can see how each of those bets we placed sort of progressed, informed the learning, and help them pivot at each step into the right product for them at the right time. All right. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Recap here with the takeaways. Think probabilistically, not deterministically. Use probabilistic forecasting. Communicate the uncertainty. If you would like to talk, if you have questions for me, please, I'd love to talk about them now. I tweeted out this slide deck. You can see my Twitter handle down in the corner. So you can get the slides pretty easily. I'll take questions, as well as if you'd like to talk about AI, bets, forecasting, or uncertainty after the fact, please get in touch, and I would be happy to talk about that.
Cool. Thank you. That was very interesting. Does anyone have any questions you'd like to ask Robert? Any thoughts? And I'm going to put that link to the slides in the chat here in case
Oh,
anybody's
thank you,
got
Mark.
that.
Excellent idea.
Okay, so any questions for Robert, feel free to type in the chat or just come off mute and feel free to speak up.
I can ask a question. When you were in phase, this is Ross, unless other people have questions. In phase 3 of your bets, you said there was a 75% chance of your being successful. To me, you said that the failure and be like, hey, this isn't a viable business model is a failure. But to me, your failure is actually getting a false positive or a false negative, where you say, yes, we can do this, and you're actually wrong. There is no market for it. Because saying, hey, this doesn't work, and you being correct is an awesome result. Saying no correctly is much better than saying yes incorrectly. So I think your odds of not giving a good forecast, I think, is your failure there. So
I think that's an excellent point. That's very
yeah,
insightful.
yeah,
I'm biased because when I was thinking of odds, I put down this based on the conversation we had with them, and
yeah,
they would, and I see what you're saying, and I completely agree.
yeah,
They would have taken, no, we can't move forward with this as a failure condition because they had already spent a considerable amount of time trying different ideas, and they were kind of at the end of their brainstorming process when they came to us and we started this whole process.
yeah.
So yet another negative result would have been difficult for them to come back to their investors with. But I do completely agree. It would have been better than moving forward and getting it wrong. So
Yeah, that
excellent
if
point.
this doesn't work, you want to know that, and you should be so happy with that result. But if that's
Yes.
not what they want to hear, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And delivering news that they may not want to hear but need to hear is itself a different talk and a different skill, but an equally important one.
yeah. And also be careful of catastrophic bets. Like 98% chance it works, you have to make sure that if it hits the 2%, you can survive it. So insurance or
Yes.
risk management is very
Existential
important.
threats,
Yeah,
absolutely a concern.
perfect.
And there's expected value and there's a variety of other calculations. If you can estimate those percentages and what you think might happen, existential threat is an excellent point to watch out for.
I love it. Yep, perfect.
Thank you, Ross.
Cool. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think some of that is covered with the idea of when you're taking a bet, you're actually risking something, and you
Yeah,
can lose a small bet, and it's not a big deal. If your bungee cord breaks, that's that's a bigger bet that you've taken there.
yeah,
And what differentiates a big and a small bet is entirely contextual. A small and a big bet may be very different for a startup versus a Fortune 10 company, but a specific skunkworks department inside that Fortune 10 may itself only have a startup budget. So small and big can again be relative there too.